Now, this video is going to be an interpretation of pretty much exactly what I do when I'm doing a creative direction for a client. Two things. The first thing is I will always present my client with two concepts. I will very rarely do three. The reason for that is because if you've done a rigorous strategy and you've done a discovery process, I actually find with my creative process, there's not very many different directions you can go in order to achieve the goals and to talk to an audience in the correct way, or at least in the best way for the client and for that audience. And so I usually find it very difficult to come up with three totally different ideas when I've got one place to go to. So my map, for example, will have two routes. It will have the expected route, one that feels a little safer and it feels a little more comfortable for the client, something that they might have been imagining, something that's going to fit with the industry and is going to just be a really good interpretation of the brand. The second direction is usually one that I've injected a little bit more creative finesse into, and it's something slightly more off the cuff, or it's maybe inspired by the aspirational audience for that client. Say, for example, they've got a current client base and they're actually wanting to talk to a new client base. I will then actually design a mood board specifically for that new client base. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do mood boards and directions, and how you come up with two different directions really depends on your creative process. For me, the directions that I do are usually based off of the client's audience or two different types of goals, or if in the discovery process I've picked up a slight disparity in personality, maybe they want to lean this way and a little bit that way, I'll show them what the two ends of that scale look like. And that's really kind of just how I focus on the directions and how I decide how those two directions are going to look. So before I get into showing you how I create them, I first want to recommend, with the creative direction that you're doing, always start out with a brain dump or a word map or a mind map, whatever you want to call it. Grab a notebook and a pen and basically just word out all the ideas you can think of conceptually for the brand. Now, one can argue that this is something that you should really only do when you're doing the logo, but I like to start right at the beginning, because when it comes down to what types of logo inspiration I'm going to look at, what types of icons and color palettes I want to pull in, I want to be making sure that I've got a focus early on in the process, because the internet is a big place and there is so much out there that if I don't already have my goggles on and know what I'm looking for, I could spend days scrolling through Pinterest alone, and never mind other places where you can get inspiration from. So for today's project, we're actually going to be looking at a boutique luxury hotel with three different destinations here in lovely South Africa, which is where I'm from, in case you didn't know that. They've got a beach destination, a bushveld destination, or should I say safari destination for those of you who don't know what bushveld means, and they've also got a sort of a mountain resort as well. So we're going to be putting together a mood board or creative direction for them. Now, in the strategic discovery process, we uncovered that they really want to keep that small boutique lodge feel with slightly more classic touches. So they don't want to be too modern. Their buildings are full of character. They've been around a long time, and so we don't want to over modernize the brand. However, they do want to appeal to a slightly younger audience, one that is not necessarily traveling through Airbnb, but have got, they're looking for interesting destinations, interesting types of travel. And so they're looking to stay at these really interesting and exciting places. So we're going to try and create two different directions for this lodge. And already what I'm thinking is that we're going to go for the typical sort of boutique hotel look. They are not huge on pushing the envelope. They enjoy tradition. They are classic hospitality. And so they don't really want to push the envelope too much. They're not interested in being too millennial, but they are interested in attracting sort of the older millennial group and beyond, couples, small family groups, etc., and even looking at corporate events. So with all of that in mind, I'm keeping those two thoughts when I'm going to be looking for inspiration. So in terms of my mind map, the words that I'm looking at are classic, eclectic, little bit something unexpected. I want to look for warm, traditional tones that speak to heritage and family, and looking to kind of bring into the logo something unexpected. So when I'm diving into looking for inspiration, I'm going to keep all of those things in mind, knowing as well that we've got an interesting market that we need to attract, and we're competing against things like Airbnb and the big hotel names as well. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to jump straight into Pinterest, and I'm basically just going to start looking for all sorts of inspiration that's got anything to do with hospitality, hotels, and the types of ideas that I really want to get across. So before I jump into Pinterest, I want to give you some advice on what you're looking for when you're coming up with the perfect mood board. It's very easy to slap a whole bunch of inspiration that you think looks cool, but you've got to remember we're designing a brand identity. And so your mood board has got to include certain things that are going to help you make creative decisions in the future when you're designing the brand. You need to include things like logo inspiration for the different types of logos you want to create. Keep in mind the differences between styles, like sans serif versus serif, ornate versus simple, etc. And you want to make sure that you're creating distinct sort of groupings for those logo styles. Then you want to make sure that you're starting to pull together a color palette. Now, the color palette can come from imagery or it can come from other references, but you want to start thinking about color, and then you actually want to make a note of that in the mood board so that the client can already start aligning themselves around that color palette. The next thing is you want to look at stationery examples. So is this brand going to need to be applied to anything in the real world? Something like business cards or letterheads or stationery in terms of envelopes or info booklets or things like that, as well as web applications as well. So does it need to be an app? Does it need to be applied to digital invoicing systems, etc.? Keep all of that in mind when you're looking for inspiration. You want to be able to show the client what the brand is going to look like in the real world, how it's going to live out, because that's going to give them that sense of life. That's going to give them that sense of longevity, and that the brand is actually more than just the logo. Of course, if you're only designing the logo, then, it's still important to show them how your logo solution could fit on collateral in the future. The next thing that you really want to include is things like illustration styles or graphic styling, pattern work, anything else that you think might be relevant, especially for a brand that's got things like packaging, e-commerce businesses, etc., product-based businesses, even a hotel, something like that, which is going to have a lot of printed stationery and things that the branding is going to need to be applied to, otherwise known as touch points, livery, collateral, whatever you want to call it. So you want to be including something like that. Then, of course, typography. You really need to include examples of typography, and not just typography from the logo's perspective, but actual lived typography. So how is the brand going to show up in terms of letterheads or font choices or things like that for social media or for print collateral? You want to be looking at typography as well. There's a couple of other things that I like to include, which are bonuses like photographic direction or art direction of some kind, if that's relevant for the brand. Of course, steer clear of adding things that have got nothing to do with the brand whatsoever. If your client has said, I don't want business cards, then by all means, please don't include a reference of business cards, because the key with creative direction is that it's custom to the client, custom to the project, that you're actually showing thought and consideration for the references you're choosing and looking to add to your mood board. This is how you're going to start creating mood boards that your clients are going to get really excited about, as opposed to creating something that just looks like a cookie cutter mood board straight off of Pinterest. Okay, with that being said, let's jump straight into the Pinterest board that I've created for our make-believe boutique hotel brand. And what we've got here is a number of different references. I went through and basically gathered all the different ideas that I had for the 2 directions I want to explore for this brand. So because we're not actually going to get as far as doing the logo, maybe in another video, let me know in the comments below. We're just doing the mood board today. And so I want to just let loose creatively, and I want to think about different ways of doing this. Okay, so the first idea that I had, one that's going to be a little closer to what I believe the client is imagining in their heads, is going to be anything to do with this gold and deep blue. This is a creative direction that really fits with their strategy, their desire to be classic, refined, but still traditional and still kind of, celebrated as still one of those classic boutique hotels. So it's not this Airbnb vibe. It's still got this, it's got a little bit of old school hotel in it. So if that makes any sense at all, but this is basically what pops into my head when I think of it. So we've got references like this with quite ornate shapes. The family who started the lodge or hotel group itself, the hotel has remained in the family for many generations now. And so they've actually got what's called a family crest. And conceptually, I'm trying to look at a way of maybe including something that looks a little bit like that for the brand. The next thing I'm also thinking about as I'm going along grabbing inspiration is how we can apply this to, of course, stationery. So I'm thinking about menu cards, business cards, stamps. I love the gold. I think it's going to be a really good idea. I'm also pulling inspiration like this, where we're talking about the application of the branding onto hotel-specific items. And I thought applying the logo or some sort of creative device to the hangers or something like that in the rooms is also just a special luxury touch, which adds that extra flavor. Then I started to think about the destinations themselves and the fact that they are this beautiful blend of rustic luxury. So the destinations are made up of these beautiful small buildings. They're in the wild, they've got beautiful views, etc. And I really wanted to try and bring in some natural texture as well. It's a nice way of making things feel a little bit more warm while still being quite premium. So I thought about blending in wood textures with a bit of leather, a bit of stone, taking inspiration from the environments where the different destinations actually are. And then I started thinking, well, what if each of the different destinations had a bit of an illustration or something to characterize that individual piece? So there's sort of the overarching brand, and then there will be the 3 different properties underneath that with their own styling. So we've got ribbons, we've got maps here, we've got room and information cards, possibly little welcome cards or something like that. Couple of photographic inspiration pieces as well, simple, clean. So there's that juxtaposition between appealing to the modern traveler, but still keeping that traditional rustic feel with a little bit of the heritage. So there's a lot going on here, but I'm thinking that we'll be able to create 2 distinct mood boards here. And I can already see that I've got 2 color directions. I can go with the blue, or I can go with the green, or maybe even blend the 2. I've got inspiration like this, which I'm really liking because I definitely think I want to show them what maybe some custom hotel postcards could look like, room key labels, etc. So there's a lot going on here that we can add. And you can see that my Pinterest board is not that huge. So this will vary depending on the client and depending on the project. Sometimes I get super clear on the ideas really quickly, and so my Pinterest boards are slightly less heavy. Other times I've got like 7 different ideas for directions that I could go in with little fleeting sort of pieces of inspiration as I'm looking for stuff. And so it really just depends on the project. But I will then come to my Pinterest board right at the end before I start making the mood board, and I'll start culling. And basically what that means is I'll start looking at inspiration and changing my mind about whether I think it's relevant. So basically another example of this is I looked at this one, and as much as I like this and I like the rustic feel, I feel like it's too rustic for the destinations. And so what I will probably do now is come in here and actually try and delete it. But now, of course, I can't remember how to use Pinterest, so there's that. But basically, you're going to go through and simplify the mood board, take some stuff off that you don't like. And then this could be considered as a mood board on its own, but you don't want to show your client this. You want to show them a curated version where you've made very specific decisions about what to include and what not to include. So with all that being said, let's jump straight into Adobe Illustrator and actually start curating our inspiration and coming up with our 2 visual directions. Okay, so jumping straight into Adobe Illustrator, all I'm really going to do is create a 1080 by 1080 artboard, and this is where I'm going to create my squares. So usually, I know that there's a quicker way to do this. I've seen the hack on Instagram, but blow me down, I cannot actually work out how to do it. So it's maybe because I'm not paying enough attention to the detail, but I basically just create 9 squares. I put them like this, and then I just use essentially, I will then group them and send them to the artboard and ungroup again, and there I've got my boards. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is first just take the outline off. I hate working with outlines on this particular thing, and then I will give them usually a very light gray so that I can see what I'm dealing with. And then basically the hack looks as follows. So I will now open up my Pinterest board on the one side and Illustrator on the other side. And what I'm going to do now is start dragging. So the first thing I want to do is try and nail down the first direction, which is this navy blue one. It's a little bit more typical. It's a little bit more classic hotel. So I want to do that one because I think it's the safe option, and I think it goes in line with what the client wants and with some of the decor and things like that. Okay, now what I'm going to do is basically just click and drag. And this works sometimes, it doesn't always work. It should, most of the time on a Mac, just work to literally click and drag, and it'll drop it into Illustrator. You won't see it straight away, but if you click in, then it suddenly appears. So yeah, all right, so I want some stationery. I also want some photographic direction. I think that's quite nice. I love the idea of this really sort of tall text. It's very premium, but I'm thinking that with the logo design, we could theoretically add a little bit of character to it and give it a bit of an edge. So we could do something like that. I'm looking at this inspiration and I'm liking it, but it looks very corporate. So I'm wanting to see if I can maybe find something that's a little bit more correct for them, and maybe something like this, but I can see the blue tones here aren't exactly right, but I'll bring it in anyway so I can have a look. Love the illustration sort of style. I definitely think some sort of embossing, but maybe something a little bit, see, this is very premium. I'm wondering if I've got something that's just a little bit more rugged. I definitely like this. Might be a little bit, I like the nature part of that one. Okay, love the leather here. It's a nice contrast, and maybe this one to have a look at. And then maybe also, I'm just going to see if there's anything. So sometimes with Pinterest, if you click on it and then you carry on down, you can see references that are very similar. And that's really, really helpful. It's a really good trick when you're looking on Pinterest specifically for inspiration. So what I'm seeing is a lot of stuff that looks very wedding-like, but this is very regal, which I like. You can drag that in. Reminder to go back and save it, obviously, which is quite useful, of course. Okay, so I think that's cool there. Now I definitely, oh, I love this key. I want to see if I can try and incorporate that. Maybe I can incorporate some of this, but not all of it, because it's a very long image. I like the maps. Maybe if we could find something else that's map focused, because creating destination maps for hotels is really, really cool, especially layouts of the camp or the lodge or the hotel itself to show guests where everything is. Maybe something like this or something like this. Of course, just save them as you go along. Love this idea. This is nice, but might be a little too beachy, a little bit too nautical. Okay, maybe a little touch of the brown and the leather would be quite nice to bring in on this. I'm also just going to pull this in. I think this is going to fit better with the other concept that I've got in my head, so I'll keep those for that. All right, now I'm going to click back into Illustrator, bring my screen out. Okay, now you can see some of the inspiration has come across as a link, because that doesn't always work, especially if the post on Pinterest itself was a video or a GIF or something, GIF. Okay, so now basically what I'm going to do is pull this all aside. And the next thing for mental clarity for myself, at least, is I'm going to start grouping these. So this is all stationery and collateral. This is texture and embossing style, illustration / graphics. Up here, logo style, photographic direction, also stationery. What is the also stationery? Let's put this under embossing. I mean, more or less. Okay, I've only got one for logo style. Maybe this can come in for logo style. So you can see now that I don't really have enough inspiration or something to pull in terms of logo style. So now I'm just going to go back to Pinterest and I'm going to see if I can pull something else that is going to be a little bit more logo style focused. So I want to make sure that I've got inspiration that covers everything, because without that, it's obviously going to be very difficult to get the client aligned around a certain style of logo. So this direction, my thought was definitely more along this line, where we've got some sort of a crest or an icon supported by typography. This one I feel like is a little bit too regal. But maybe something like this could work quite well. Let's have a look at what other inspiration pops up when it comes to this. See, I think I'm definitely thinking that we need a balance. This is quite nice. So let's grab that. I think that's going to give us a nice balance of logo styles. Okay, so now what I've got is a whole bunch of inspiration. Now I'm going to pull aside the things that I think are really going to work well for this this project. So I really like that. I think I really like the more, see, this is where I'm going to start tying things in, the slightly more modern illustration. So you get that celebration of old versus new. I really like this for this brand. I think that's great. Let's have some photographic direction and maybe some stationery. So how are we going to bring the contrast in? We need a bit of texture going on here. So maybe a bit of the rustic texture as well. Okay, so in order to start putting these things in now, basically what you can do is you can drag it, Shift Command bracket, left bracket for shortcut on Mac. You put it behind everything. Make sure that you've selected both, and then you just Command 7. And that is going to give you the opportunity to mask it with that shape so that you can move the things around within the frame without having to try and crop the images. So basically, if you now want to edit how that is, you just double click, it takes you into the clipping group, and now you can move things around within that square. And you can just position it as you like. So I'm going to try and put some of this stuff in now, and we'll see how it goes. So usually what I'm trying to do with my mood boards is create balance, and oftentimes what I will do is put the lighter inspiration pieces in the middle squares and the darker inspiration pieces in the corners if it's relevant. And often what I'll try and do is split. So if there's a photographic inspiration, I'll split that with something that's more digital, so that you get a nice visual break and your eye can sort of dance around and look at different pieces of inspiration without getting too overwhelmed. Okay, so now I've realized I don't really have enough inspiration, so I'm going to start bringing in some other ideas and putting those in. Sometimes in my mood boarding process, I'll actually pick up that I've not aligned things properly, and then that's relatively easy to fix just with your alignment tools. So you can just go back and fix this. Obviously, I do like the spacing and stuff to be properly balanced. You can see here that this is not quite right, but that's because the image isn't fitting in the frame properly. So I'll just come in here, make this a little bit bigger, and just make sure it's fitting in the frame properly as I want it. To get out of your clipping mask, you just double click anywhere on the image and it'll take you back out again. Okay, so I like where this is going. It's giving me good sort of vibes. I'm going to try and incorporate this key somehow. Maybe I should do it like this. I don't love that. So the other idea is sometimes when I've got an image that doesn't quite fit, I actually make it much smaller and I balance it in, and then I take the frame itself and just color pick so that I can balance it in the middle. Obviously you can only do that when you've got an image or reference that's, you know, fully that actually fits and doesn't have a nuanced background. So sometimes what I will do now with the middle of the mood board is I'll either try and put the color palette there, or I'll actually try and put the audience there. So I try and find a reference picture of the clientele, and I usually pull this from my strategy docs, because in my strategies I usually create personas for the client, customer personas, and then I usually pull that image in so that they can get the reference of the fact that this might appeal to that certain client. But just for the sake of this mood board particularly, I'm going to try and actually bring in some color. So usually what I just do is some color panels, and how I duplicated that was I just alt click and drag, and then I just go Command D, which duplicates the previous movement. Which works quite well. So I'm going to make this a bit smaller, and then I'm actually gonna, because what I want to do is have two smaller ones and two bigger ones. I'm going to pull those out to match, and then basically I'm going to just use my color picker tools to try and find color. And I really like the idea of the blue and the brown and maybe the beige, and then I'm thinking, yeah, so this is a really nice neutral palette. Maybe a darker beige or something like that would work really lovely. And then I usually just take these colors and make them a bit smaller so that it sort of stands out quite nicely. The other thing I could do is just move this around so that the two dark colors aren't right next to each other. I don't know. How does that look? Yeah. That looks quite nice. Now I just want to make sure that they are positioned correctly. I know I'm being very specific about how I like things to be fitted, but I don't like the white gaps. So, okay, cool. I'm going to group that, and I'm just going to center it. Make sure that it's centered. Cool. Okay, so I'm liking this. Now what I sometimes do is I'll take this and I just pull out another one. I go into my color guide here, and you can pick tones. So I just try and pick a lighter tone just to see how the two contrast, because this color now needs to fit with this color. So maybe the lighter tone actually comes from this tone here instead, and I pick a different color for that. So what I'll do now is I'll come in and grab another tone for this. And I'm just thinking maybe it actually needs to be another version of the brown. And so it's, okay, interesting. So this is a very gray brown. So let's have a look at that now as a color palette and see what I think of that. Maybe what we could try do, sometimes literally just flipping the layout works very nicely as well. I'm not loving that, so what I'll do is I'll just undo. She just liked the simplicity of the other one. Okay. Of course, when you're doing creative direction with your clients, you can also disclaimer that the color palette could change slightly depending on, of course, what you actually end up with. So with that being said, I think this is the first mood board that we've got sorted out, and the next few steps will be me working out what to do with the rest of the color palettes, or the rest of the inspiration, should I say, and creating that second mood board. Okay, so it's been a little while and I've spent some time sorting out the second version of the creative direction for our boutique hotel, and I'll quickly talk you through some of my decisions. So I think when creating mood boards, you can either go totally different, like I said, or your mood boards will probably follow a kind of a theme, and there'll be similar overlaps between the concepts. And I think that this is actually a good thing, because it shows that you're kind of in one-minded direction for the brand. Sometimes, and I'll show you an example in a minute of a brand direction that actually had 3 totally different concepts. Sometimes you can take a brand in multiple different directions depending on what the client's focus is going to be. For this imaginary client specifically, the direction is sort of very similar. On the left, we've got our, as mentioned, we've got a little bit more typical hotel direction, one that is a little bit more refined. It's got that beautiful deep blue, so it does feel a little bit more professional and it feels a little bit more luxurious. And then we've got our second direction, which is me leveraging off of the imaginary sort of phrasing from the client, which was they didn't want to give up the rugged feel and the rustic sort of inspiration of nature. So I wanted to bring that in, and using, obviously this is a conceptual project, so this is not real, but in a real life project, especially with hospitality, you want photographs of the actual destination, of the lodges or the hotels or the rooms themselves, so that you can start getting a feel for whether or not the branding is actually going to support what the place looks like. So this is kind of a snapshot of what one of the sort of premium rooms looks like at one of the lodges. This is kind of an inspiration piece for how they can bring texture and a little bit of that refined luxury in. We've got the stone and the wood showcasing here with the deep green and the gold, which I thought was a really nice way of bringing in a bit of luxury. For this direction, I also wanted to recommend to them that we step away from the sort of very modern, refined, illustrative look, which still gives it that personal feel, but is a little bit more premium. And then instead for this direction, we're going for a little bit more of like an on-the-nose, natural feel with these more scientifically accurate illustrations, which I love the idea of, and I think that it would really, really work for this brand. It's going to give it that sort of unique feel, and it's also going to be very reminiscent of being outside and in nature and the celebration of the art of bringing in natural textures into a space. The logo direction for this direction as well, I wanted to sort of balance it between a nice stately premium look, which is going to celebrate the heritage still, but then I wanted to see if we could balance it with some handwriting. But definitely you can see across both directions, technically speaking, the logos are very similar, because I feel in my mind for this brand, there is really only kind of one look that I'm going for the logo that I think is really going to work. And then it's just going to come down to font selection and the exact way we bring in illustration. So with that being said, now typically what I would go and do is I would either do a third concept, and I said earlier on in this video that it's very rare that I'll do a third concept. There are some certain circumstances where that is needed, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. But for this brand, 2 directions is enough, and I think that that's great. So we've got a slightly different color palette going on, and now what I will probably do is take these 2 concepts and give them each a name or a title of some kind, or somehow put them in a bucket so that it's easier for the client to understand that they are different and that they will need to choose an option. So what we'll typically do is we'll take these, I'll export them out as high-res JPEGs, and then I will pop them into a presentation template that I have on file. And I do tend to adapt this template to fit with different clients and different different projects, but most of the time it follows the same method. So let's jump straight in to what that template actually looks like, and it's really called the Creative Direction template. And this, I've stripped it back just slightly for the sake of this video, but I always include who it's for, who it's prepared by, and then some contact details. And I think it's really, really important to focus on how you present your mood boards, because how we present our work is almost more important, if not the most important part of the design process, because it's your job to translate and to make sure that your creative decisions actually make sense for your client. And often they don't really understand the benefit of a mood board. They've maybe never done one before. They're not really sure what they're looking at. And so you've really got to guide them through the process of why we're doing this in the first place, why this step is important, what they need to be looking out for, and how they need to be giving you feedback. So I usually just pop it into a template like this. I usually remind them of why this is important. I then go back and iterate some stuff about this strategy. And so what I will then do is talk about the brand themselves, some of their values, and then I'll also talk about the premium, or the primary, should I say, goal for this brand. Because what that's going to do is it's going to help us remember what's important about the brand when it comes to deciding on a creative direction. And then I'll go into presenting the concepts. So this is an example of a real client presentation that I sent out, give or take a few details here and there that have been changed for the presentation, for the video. But this is pretty bang on for what I would present to a client. And so I would then take those hotel mood boards and put them into a presentation very similar to this. So the first concept, which I named Making a Statement, this was the culmination of that concept. And you'll see what I usually do with the mood boards is I add labeling to them, because sometimes what I do is inside the descriptions, I'll reference one or two of the images. It also helps my client, when they're giving feedback, be able to reference a certain image and give me specific feedback on that specific one, rather than going, oh, it's the third image from the left, and so this just becomes a lot easier. And then I'm going to touch on a couple of key things when presenting. So I'm first going to talk about the core concept of this mood board. So what was I thinking about? What was the overarching idea when it came to presenting the concept? And what types of things was I really wanting to anchor on? I'll then touch on color, type choices, imagery choices, and then texture or patterns or creative devices like illustration. Just depends on the actual concept. I'm then always going to include a color palette. And you can see there's lots of different ways of doing the mood boards. One of the directions which I mentioned is putting the audience or client themselves in the actual mood board, which creates a little bit of alignment and familiarity for the client. They can kind of see themselves existing in this brand space. So I find that works really well. But also popping the color palette in the middle, like we did for our hotel mood boards, works as well. Then I'll present the second concept with another name, the Refined Professional. And here you can see the juxtaposition of ideas and creativity. I think with the hotel mood boards, you can see that there's a lot of overlap and that we're really in one direction. But with this one, there are two very distinct, and you'll see the third one is also very different, because in the strategic discovery process, we worked out that, all of these words were very important. But when it came down to which words were the most important, that was what I wanted to clarify. Now, of course, one could argue that these words could definitely be applied to this mood board, but that's where describing the core concept comes in. And it really describes what elements I want to focus on, because if we try to do all of this and all of the one from the previous direction, and we try to create a brand that was all of those things, yikes. So what I'm actually trying to do here is distill right down and say to him, okay, cool. What are your key priorities? What are the things that are the most important to you? Is it being refined, slick, clean, modern? Or do you want a little bit of an edge? Do you want a little bit of grunge? Do you want that dark contrast? What is really important to you? Because if we're clear, then it's going to be a lot easier to create a brand identity that follows. So this was the second direction. And then the third direction, totally different. This was called Boldly Unique. And this was what I called my wild card. This was a concept that I wasn't sure that he would like, but I had a feeling. And I knew that he'd spoken about wanting to stand out and wanting to be unique. And in our discovery process, realized that he didn't just want to be that way, he was already that way, at least in my eyes. And I think part of my job as a designer, and essentially when you get to that stage in your career where you're now trying to encourage these business owners to be ambitious, to be brave, to take steps to creating a brand identity that they can aspire towards. I often get comments from clients saying, they feel like they've got to now live up to their branding, which is very humbling for me, but it also gives me a little pat on the back, because isn't that exciting for clients to look at their branding and go, what a cool thing to be able to create. And so I always like to create a little bit of a wild card for my clients. And ironically, he ended up going with this direction, said it really stood out to him, really attracted the edgy side of him that enjoys interesting art and shape, and wanted to create a personality in the industry that was distinct. We ended up actually blending a little bit of this concept with this last concept, literally just by bringing in a couple of sort of more structured line work, as well as toning down the orange a little bit and bringing in a green as well. So it actually ended up really nice, and it was really exciting to look at. So you can see here that I've changed this to shapes and creative devices. So you can adapt it, but I think it's really important to annotate your creative directions. Talk your client through what you were thinking when you made these choices, so that it's not just a case of slapping a bunch of images together and going, hey, how about this? I've got considered effort to show him what I'd like to do with the logo, the typography, how I want to balance texture and photography, how I'd like to take this photograph, by the way, is one of his actual photographs. So there was that. Shape, print, texture, color, all of those things, really, really important for your creative direction. I'll then do a comparison. So the last second last page of the presentation is always a comparison of all of the concepts side by side, so that they can really see the contrast and they can really solidify on a direction that works for them. And of course, I'll just say thank you. And I think the next most important thing is to remember that if you're shy and you don't like presenting things on a call and you're not very good at it, your next best bet is to record a video walkthrough. And you can use a platform called Loom to do this, and I'm a big fan. We use it a lot here at Flux for our community feedback and reviews. So any of you who are already students will be very familiar with Loom, but make use of it for presenting client work to your clients. If you don't want to sit on a live call, if it makes you really nervous, then that's fine. You can practice talking to a camera, talking to your screen, and explaining your thinking. Trust me, it will go the mile with your clients, and it will be a much better process for them and a much more holistic experience. They'll also be able to hear your tonality, and you might sort of be able to explain something to them that they might have totally missed otherwise. You've also got to keep in mind that even though you put all the effort into writing those captions, they may not read all of it. So presenting it on a call or over a video is a great idea. Otherwise, you can fall back on just the text. So if those two ideas really don't work for you, that's fine. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this as a designer, but I do highly recommend that you have some sort of conversation at some point with your clients about the creative direction. It is, after all, a really, really important phase of the project. All right, so with all of that being said, that about wraps up the creative direction process that I usually follow with all of my clients. What will usually happen after this is they'll come back with some feedback and we'll bang around some other ideas and we'll sort of settle on a final mood board, which the client will need to then sign off before we can move into the design phase. I then always include that mood board in the style guides right at the end of the process. So if you found this helpful, please let us know in the comments below. If you want to see more branding and creative process content, then also please let us know. That's it from me. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.